All right. Well, thanks so much for having me here. I'm very new in this crowd, and I'm very happy to be part of it. And I hope I can join you more often. I apologize for not being able to make it physically to the conference, but yeah, I plan to do it in the future. So this is joint work with Motohiro Kumagai at Australian National University and Sadia Mansour, who's a PhD student of mine here at Clark University. And let me say, it's very preliminary, and so your feedback would be more than welcome. And also, we're quite new in this conflict literature. I can tell you how we got involved in to all this, but yeah, I'm quite new. Me personally, Moto has done a bit more work, but I'm yeah, a rookie here. So anyway, so we're putting together a new data set on Native American conflicts, and we're gonna show you some correlates of these conflicts and with. Can you hear me well? It's good. Yeah, some correlates with an emphasis on horses, and I'll explain why we think horses may be important. So I plan to introduce what we're doing a little bit, and then talk about horses, and more specifically what we're doing in this paper. Talk about the new data that we're putting together, empirical strategy and some preliminary results, and some conclusions and future work. So let me say that this is really part of a big agenda. We've been working with on Native American topics now for 2-3 years, and we've discovered that there's really a lot to be done. Now there's many data issues, and we thought one contribution would be to create a few new data sets that people can then use in the future. So we know that the diverse geography and climates of North America affected tribal societies, Native American societies that settle in the region and shape their relationship with each other. And like many other indigenous nations around the world, North American tribes were divided in different groups, tribes, bands, based on different things like language, territorial control, interpersonal alliances, and so on. And naturally, they were involved in conflicts like most societies around the world. Now, what drove these conflicts? I guess that's a big part of what this conference is about. So many factors, we're going to highlight some of them, including displays of manpower, struggles for territorial power, and conflicts over securing economic gains were really important. They were also frequent in areas that share resources such as the bison, water, and climate agricultural land, and others. Clashes between nomadic groups were also very common, and these were groups that tended to move around to looking for economic resources for survival. So the arrival of colonizers in America, of course, transformed the socio-political dynamics of the whole region, introducing opportunities and challenges for Native Americans. And one of the most significant factors, external or kind of shocks, was the reintroduction of the horse. That, of course, was a big shock in many dimensions. And part of what we're doing is exploring how horses affected subsistence modes for Native Americans, how they affected welfare, conflicts. We're going to talk about this today, long-term population trends and things like this. But today we're going to mostly focus on conflicts. So the horse existed in the Americas a long time ago, but then archaeologists have found out that it was driven, the horse was driven to extinction about 12,000 years ago, most likely as a result of climate change or overhunting. We don't know for sure, but the truth is most horses or all horses disappeared from America. But then they were reintroduced by European conquistadores, colonizers. between the 15th and 16th century. There's a bunch of books and papers that discuss this. And in particular, there was this expedition by Hernando de Soto, a Spanish colonizer who was in Mexico, moved to North America, or like to what's today the US. My reading of this is that he was looking for gold and silver mostly, couldn't find much, and then decided to go back to Mexico. And when he did that, he left behind a bunch of horses, not many, but then these horses start spreading around. That's what I've read, and the story that seems to be consistent with what happened. So this small group of horses were there, and then presumably they spread around the plains and the west, mostly the west of the US. And that was done through natural dispersion. There were lots of raids, some tribes like the Pueblo stealing horses from the Spaniards and from other nations, from other tribes. I'm going to use the term tribes and nations indistinctively here. Some people claim it's better to use Native American nations, but I think tribes is correct. It's okay too. And also there were trade between nations, right? The Comanches were known for trading horses with other tribes and with colonial powers too. So a small group of horses that then they spread around, and we're gonna try to do something with that variation. So now we have these colonizers with these new technologies and horses, and of course this changed the socio-political landscape of Native American nations, exacerbating conflicts, probably, that's what we're going to try to argue, and creating new power dynamics. For example, within a tribe or a band of Native Americans, being a skillful warrior or a tribal leader was very much linked to whether that warrior had horses or how many of those horses had. So this opens a whole new window of whether horses led to more inequality among tribes, which is something, or even within tribes, which is something we're trying to explore too. This is another thing we're trying to do. It also has to do with, it can be related to gender inequality, like with horses becoming more important for warfare, maybe the role played by men increase relative to women. Something we'd like to explore too, but not today. So these are the Comanche, and this was known as the prototypical horse nation. So there is this quote by a nice book by Frank Dobby, claiming that the Comanches developed relationships with Spaniards. They were in the southwest of the US mostly. I'll show you a map. And they were known as the horse Indians. They were very skilled as horse breeders, although according to this author, they were more about stealing horses than breeding them. Although, I've read books that claim that they were very good at breeding horses too. In any case, they were really unmatched in horsemanship, and that this author and some others argue that they became the most powerful Native American nation, at least for a couple of centuries, in large part because of their horse adoption. Feel free to ask questions if you have some. So let me discuss a little bit how horses have been important in history. By the way, I didn't say that. I'm an economic historian / urban economist, so I do both things. I care about economic history, and I do most of my work is on urban economics and population. So this paper fits well in my population kind of research. So horses have been really important for state formation through history. There are at least, I'm sure there's more authors there, but Carles Boix at Princeton University has a nice book on this, and then my co-author Moto has a paper on that too. And of course, I'm sure you wouldn't be surprised if I tell you that horses have been key for many empires. So, for example, for Alexander the Great, in the 300 BC years, according to several books, Alexander the Great inherited 400 light horses scouts and 3,300 heavy horse cavalry. And then the Thracian and Persian cavalry amounted to 6,000 before the beginning of the campaign. And then there were a bunch of battles like Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, in which the role of horses, according to these accounts, was really important. And of course, we all know that Alexander the Great established probably the largest empire we've known, and maybe in large part maybe because of horses. Byzantine Empire in this long period, 395, 1453 CE, the Byzantine Empire spent lots of resources to produce high quality horses. So there was this production function of horses, and there were all these regulations like the Theodosian Code protecting horses, a little bit like in the Far West, where horses were a very important asset, right, in the US. By the Middle Ages, armies were really dependent on horses, not so much infantry. And yeah, it had the Byzantine army had 150,000 cavalry, which was a big number in those years, in those eras. Mongol expansion, again, horses really important for the Mongols, with Genghis Khan and successors conquering the Khwarezmian Empire, Russia, Baghdad, and China, establishing the Yuan dynasty in China, and by 2020, for example, the Mongol army numbered 150,000, and most of them were cavalry. And one remarkable thing about the Mongols, what I've learned after reading about them, is that speed was a really important quality of their army. And of course, with horses, they could achieve that. They could march 180 miles in only 3 days, which I think is a pretty good speed back in that day. Islamic armies, horses very important for many of these Muslim or Islamic militaries. Battles such as Yarmouk, Siffin, the Qadisiyah, and the Umayyads, who conquered what's today Spain and Portugal, used horses very heavily. Indeed, I have a paper on the Spanish Reconquest, and I never looked at horses, but one could make maybe the argument that they managed to do that to conquer what's today Spain and Portugal, in large part because of their better technology in the sense of using horses. I'm not sure if that's the case, but I like to explore that. Ottoman Empire, starting in 1299, also heavily dependent on horses, and even with gunpowder and other things, horses remain really important. And I'm going to speed up a little bit. In China, we see a similar story. The Shang and Zhou dynasties used chariots as key weapons, and then in the Warring States era, light cavalry was also really determinant. The same in the Tang dynasty with 300,000 horses. And except for the Mongol conquest, China managed to repel lots of these nomadic threats from the north, presumably also with the help of horses. Anyway, so let's talk about Native Americans a little bit more. So what is it that we do here? The main goal of today's presentation is to show you or explore how horse adoption in North America significantly changed the pre-existing sociopolitical landscape among Native Americans. And in particular, today, I'll tell you something about bilateral conflicts between different tribes or nations, and between tribes and colonizers, and also treaties between Native Americans and colonizers. More specifically, let me tell you about the data we've been collecting, which is has been a lot of work, and we hope to, for people to use it and contribute to improve this data set. So I'm more than happy to discuss with you projects. Number one, and this is maybe the most interesting thing for this audience, is that we construct a new data set on Native American wars and conflicts between 1500 and 1900, collecting data from many sources. Didn't list them all here. We rely heavily on the Encyclopedia of Native American Wars and Warfare, and then a bunch of books and papers, some of them old, some of them newer. And this has not been digitized, so we're doing this manually. We should use a machine learning routine, which we haven't yet, but it's very time intensive. That's what I'm trying to say. So we're in the process of collecting this data. Number two, so we document the spread of horses in North America. I'm going to show you a bunch of maps that we've been working on or with. So there is a map by a paper by Haynes, an old map that looks like this. So horses were left, according to Haynes, were left here by De Soto, this Spanish colonizer, and then they spread like that, meaning they spread north and west, and to some extent to the east. All these are rivers, and what we see, they were able to kind of estimate or predict the years at which horses arrived. So, for example, around here in 1600, 1659, 1700, and the farther you move north or east, the later they were adopted. So we took this map and we georeference it with a lot of work, because that was not a great map. I mean, it was a useful map, but didn't have many details. But we managed to do this, which is the blue dots are nations for which we know the year of horse adoption. This comes from Haynes and from many other sources. So, by the way, what I'm plotting here is North America, the US mostly, and this is a map of 1600 that we borrow from O'Leary. I can give you the source, and I don't know if you can read it, but every region is a different tribe. So this big region is the Utes, the Comanche were here, the Cree had an immense amount of land up north between the US and Canada. Then, I don't know, the Pawnee, the Shoshone, the Sioux, with all these bands, the Teton, Arikara, Yankton, and so on. And so we have this map. We have these blue dots, which are dates of horse adoption. And then for those nations for which we don't have data, we interpolate it. For example, for the Ute, we don't have any account of when they received horses. But because horses were there, the Navajos had them at some point, and the Arapahoes, we interpolate that based on who has it around you and based on that Haynes map. So light color means early adoption. So naturally, near Mexico, horses were adopted early because that's where they were left. And then the darker it gets, the later the horse adoption, right? So the very dark is around 1800. So what we see is that there is a south-north gradient. Not many nations, initially the southern nations or tribes adopt the horse, and then it goes to the north. And to the west, it takes much longer, probably, and we're exploring this because these small nations or tribes relied a lot on fishing, so they couldn't care less about horses, presumably. By the way, I'm only focusing on this orange area because the east, we don't have good data. It's too far away to interpolate this, and we don't have data on when horses were adopted here. We presume horses were not that important either in the east because of I don't know, maybe the kind of the landscape and because of more dense populations and more influence from the colonizers. In any case, we focus on the orange part, and that's our data on horses.
We have a question from the audience.
Sure.
There's a few outliers more to the north on the left side that shows a bit earlier adoption. What are those? They look interesting.
You mean in the north? Oh, you
It,
mean this kind of
yeah,
yellowish things?
yeah,
I would have, well, the Shoshone is one of them. If you refer to this one, the Shoshone, the flathead, and I don't, and the Blackfoot, I think they adopted horses pretty early. I'll have to confirm that, but yeah, it looks like this is yellowish. Why did they adopt so early? I would have to explore that a bit more. But I think the Shoshone, I know stories that they were very related to the Crow and the Arapaho and the Ute, so maybe there was some trade involved in that. Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, definitely. There are outliers. The Illinois and the Missouri seem to have adopted pretty soon. And yeah, we I can tell you more stories about specific nations. But yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So all right. So right, and then we end up with this histogram of horse adoption. These are this is not cumulative. This is when horses arrive for the first time. So what this is saying is that not many tribes or nations adopted in the 1600s. Most of them did it in the 1700s, and by the 1800s, the newcomers were kind of a small number because almost everyone had horses already. Okay, and okay, so that's what I have to say about horse adoption. More data that we're putting together. So we merge data on treaties and land cessions to colonizers, right? So when a Native American tribe had a battle with some colonizer, sometimes they sign agreements and that involve land cession. So we have data on this. It's not our data, it comes from Royce and the Bureau of American Ethnology, but what we've done is merge it to with our homeland maps. Okay, so it's been quite a lot of work, still a little bit in progress, but I'll show you some results there. And then I guess the elephant in the room is that horse adoption is endogenous. So I'll tell you about an instrumental variable that we've constructed and we're going to try to use. Not today, but soon. I'll tell you more about the instrument. It's based on a least cost path. I'll tell you about it in a second. What about conflicts? So many types of conflicts. Conflicts between, first of all, we distinguish between conflicts within a tribe and between tribes. So, for example, the Sioux had many bands, and there were lots of wars between bands within the Sioux. But then most of our observations are going to be wars between the Sioux and the Comanche and the Arapahos, and so on. And then we also have wars between indigenous nations and colonial powers. Okay, why did these guys fight? We found like many references in books, and before the Europeans arrived, lots of fights about land, water, and bison. After they came, lots of battles about horses and fur trade. So I don't know. Let me show you the bison map, which is quite interesting. So this is a map by Hornaday in 1889 that shows the population, the stock of bison over time. Yeah, this is a sad graph, but probably wouldn't surprise many people. What the pinkish area shows is the area where buffaloes or bison were in 1730. Then by 1870, it's a much smaller area, the brown one. And by 1889, it's just these blue spots. So naturally, the bison plays a big role in all these conflicts, and we're gonna try to explore that. Indeed, there are many accounts of wars or conflicts between tribes involving bison, right? So for example, the Sioux and the Cheyenne, located in the Great Plains, what's today the Dakotas and the Montana, fought a lot of bison hunting grounds. The Crow and the Blackfeet also fought about bison herds and hunting territories and so on. Yeah, okay. And yeah, same, there are conflicts for water, the Shoshone and the Paiute fighting in Nevada and Utah for water resources and things like that. Okay, I'm not going to spend more time here. And then there are wars between, or conflicts between Native Americans and colonial powers. And initially there were mostly about natural resources like gold, silver, land, and water. Later on, they involve more the bison and fur trade. So we'll try to think about all this in our analysis. So this is a histogram of the number of bilateral conflicts among indigenous nations. And so not many conflicts at the beginning, more conflicts later on, and in the 1800s, not so much. So the peak is around, mid 18th century. Now there is a fundamental issue here, and I discussed this with Mike at some point, that maybe, lack of conflict here may mean lack of data, and we're working on trying to convince people that that's not the case. Like, we have few conflicts here, not because they were not reported or collected, but because they were not there. But I don't have a strong argument to make. We realize that maybe a potential issue, and we're trying to deal with it. Okay, if we do this by region, same story, lots of conflicts in the 1700s, and now we split this in different regions: Northwest, Plains, wars with colonizers, Southwest, Southeast, and Northeast. And what the main highlight here is that most of the conflicts happen in the Plains. At least that's what our data tells us. The Plains were an area where there were lots of fights, both between tribes and between tribes and the colonizers. Okay. And this is a simple scatter plot without controlling for anything else, but just to show you that if you correlate how many years you had horses, right? We know the year of horse adoption for all these tribes. You can count how many years they've had horses by the 1800 or mid 1800s, and the number of conflicts. And this is a very positive correlation. So without looking at this in any more detail, we would say, more horses and conflicts are correlated. Okay, I'm not saying this is a causal relationship, but it's quite strong. Not driven by outliers. Indeed, there are some outliers like the Acoma, who had many conflicts. Sorry, who had horses for a long time but didn't have many conflicts. But it's quite robust. And then the other thing we see is that the Great Plains have, really more conflicts, with the Sioux and the Comanche and the Apache in the Southwest being on top of this number of conflicts. If you do the same with conflicts with colonial powers, the correlation is much weaker. So horses don't seem to matter much to fight the colonizers, or at least that's one interpretation of this graph. Okay. More data. So we're very proud of this. We found this book on gun frontiers by Secoy in 1953. So according to Secoy, guns were only available to the east of the Red Line in 1675. By 1710, they moved naturally to the west. And by 1790, they were much more widespread. So we're going to try to incorporate that in our regressions, right? So the Crow may have more conflicts now that they have guns, right? In 1790 relative to 1710, where they didn't have access to those guns, or it was harder for them to access these guns. And then we have a messy map of the Western frontier by this econometrica paper. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Can you go back one slide?
Yeah.
Yes. So this is the dispersion of guns from the East Coast, presumably the British colonies and maybe the French in that side. Was there really no dispersion of guns from the Spanish in California and Mexico?
Very good question. I read a couple of books. I cannot tell you which one, but apparently the Spaniards were very worried about the Native Americans having access to guns, and they restricted them as much as they could. I'm not sure they were successful or how successful they were at that, but that was the goal. Whereas the French and the British had a much more free market approach. I'm selling you guns, you give me bison. So that's a very good point. But I think historical accounts suggest that not many guns came from the south.
So British and French were arming the Indians to help fight each other. Spaniards didn't have that problem.
Okay.
The Spanish and
Can you say that again? Sorry.
He said the British and French were arming the Native Americans to fight each other. They had
That's another.
their own proxy tribes.
That could be another possibility, not just for trade, but so that they would fight with each other. I didn't think about that. Yeah, good point. Yeah, but apparently the Spaniards were not that interested in that, in Native Americans having guns. Thanks.
They didn't have an enemy they needed help with.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. So these guys had I don't know if that helps. This econometric paper looks at the western frontier or the eastern frontier, whatever you want to call it, and basically in 1790 the colonizers or the white population, I'm not sure how to call them, were around here, and then they kept moving west. It becomes a bit messy, but mostly over time this frontier moves to the west. So, naturally, being close to this frontier may have something to do with conflicts, especially conflicts with the colonizers. So we're going to try to look at distance of, the centroid of each of these nations to the frontier and see how that affects things. I don't have this today. Okay, so let me show you some regressions before it's too late. So preliminary, so take this with a pinch of salt. So we're going to use a Poisson pseudo-maximum likelihood model. Why? Well, because there are lots of zeros, right? So our data it's like a trait, bilateral trait data, right? So I have the Apache against the Comanche, the Apache against the Ute, the Apache against the Shawnee, and so on. And if they never fought, that's going to be a zero. So for many of these pairs, we have zeros. So a good thing to do when that happens is to use the Poisson pseudo-maximum likelihood, which people in trade use to estimate gravity models. And so, we're correlating the probability of having a conflict between nation I and nation J that can include Native Americans and colonizers too, at period T as a function of whether these nations had horses at that point, a bunch of other X's, regional fixed effects, tribe fixed effects, and and that's the first regression we're going to run. And then we do the same with treaties. So what's the probability that two nations, or mostly in this case, going to be a nation and a colonizer, sign a treaty as a function of a bunch of things that I'll discuss in the next slide. But again, the horses being an important variable here, presumably. So this is what we got for now. And I'll keep you updating on this in the next months, or we can talk about it. So if you look at all conflicts, this is the first column. If two nations had the same language, they tend to fight less, which is an interesting result. Common sense, probably, but so there are a bunch of languages. I think it's 5 or 6 mostly big languages, then they spread in many other small languages. But if they have kind of a common language, they fight less, and that's quite significant. If one of the nations has horses, there's going to be more conflict. That's what our regressions tell us at this point. If one of the regression has of the contenders has an ally, meaning, it's the Shawnee and the British against the Apache, then that tends to generate more conflict. And differences between horses, like how many more years of horses one tribe had with respect to other, kind of an inequality measure in horse adoption, also leads to more conflict. which maybe it's saying that, big guys would fight small guys. So I don't know. It's less likely that the Apache and the Comanche fight because they both have horses, but instead they're going to try to fight with someone who doesn't have horses. That's one interpretation of these results. If we look at intertribal only, forget about colonial powers, basically the same results. But now something interesting is that if both nations rely on the bison, and we have measures of reliance on bison from Murdoch and other sources, then there's a lot of conflict, and that makes sense to us too. It's consistent with what I showed you before, lots of accounts of these wars for fighting over the bison. For colonial powers, now common language doesn't matter, which kind of makes sense because this is Spanish and the British fighting someone who doesn't speak the same language anyway. Horses still seem to be associated with more conflicts, and yeah, doesn't matter if one or two of the contenders had horses. And yep, that's pretty much the main message of this table. When I put things together, things are similar. If we look at treaties, so we find that if two nations had the same language, so this is treaties between Native American tribes, common language, more likely that you sign an agreement, which seems a good thing or a natural thing to think. But horses, again, seem to lead to more conflict and less agreement. So I guess it was harder to negotiate if one of us or both of us had horses, because that was there was a bigger threat of retaliation or conflict. That's our reading of this. If you were nomadic, meaning if you moved a lot, it's less likely you're going to sign a treaty. Okay, so this is what we got in terms of results. Let me tell you a little bit more. I don't know if there is a question in the chat or no. Okay. Is there? No, we're good.
Oh, yeah, there's a question from Mike.
Mike. Oh, yes. One with horses means only one. Yeah, one of the two contenders has horses and the other not yet at that point in time. Do you know who wins these wars? Does the side with horses usually win? We are collecting some data on who wins. We don't always know that. Sometimes it's a bit unclear, but definitely we know it for a bunch of battles. So we should incorporate that, Mike. Not yet, but thank you. It's coming. The Spanish were peace-loving. I don't know if that's true, but I'm from Spain, so maybe I may like that. All right, good. Let me move on then. Okay, so let me talk about reverse causality and these things that we worry about when we run regressions. So there are two big endogeneity concerns. One is reverse causality and the other one omitted variables. I'm sure everyone can think of many reasons why that's the case. Native Americans involved in conflict before the arrival of Europeans may adopt the horse to reduce future conflicts, for example, right? So more conflicts. We're trying to say more horses, more conflicts, but maybe it's the other way around, right? More conflicts, then you want to adopt more horses or less. And you can think of this in terms of trade. If you were trading with colonizers and hunting, that may have led to more horse adoption or earlier horse adoption. Omitted variables, I'm sure you can think of many. Omitted variables like competition over shared resources, we control for the bison, but there are other things like agricultural land, which is not so easy to measure, may affect conflict, and it's hard to measure that. Trade routes, access to guns, rifles, availability of land to raise horses, and even abundance of metal. So, to ride a horse a bit is very useful, and for that you need metal. So availability of metal may be an important variable that we should control for, but we haven't done that yet. Anyway.
Is there any literature on alternative bit materials? It seems to me that bone or wood or even leather could potentially make for a bit material. I'm wondering if there's archaeological or cultural research on this.
Great question, and I have no idea, to be honest. But my co-author should be able to answer this because he wrote a paper talking a lot about the beat. I'll tell him to email you. I don't know. I guess not, because his point is that historically in Eurasia, horses developed near where the metal was. So that's kind of his main point, but he may tell you more, or I'll send you the paper if you want. So what do we do? This is a cool thing we try to do. So this guy, Omer Ozak at Southern Methodist University, he's a PhD at Brown. He constructed this very cool human mobility index that basically divides the wall in squares of, I forgot, 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, I think. And he looks at the cost of people moving from one square to the other, controlling for geography, transportation at different points in time, and so on. Very cool. So we thought we could, leverage on that. So we were gonna, instead of a human mobility index, we construct a horse mobility index, which is the same, but now we interact with water. So the idea is, well, horses cannot cross deep rivers or lakes. So unless they have a human who helps them do that, they're not going to be able to do that. So the idea of this human mobility index horse mobility index, that's going to tell us how easy it is for horses to move from Mexico, where they were originally, to the north or to the west. And this has nothing to do, in principle, with our outcome variables. It's a geography instrument. It works quite nice. Okay, let me show you the instrument. This is the least cost path. So horses started here, and what this is saying that it was easy for horses to move. The red area means easy to move, but the farther you move north, the harder it is. It's not a very detailed map, but we did this for every cell. I can tell you more about it later on. It's a great index in the sense it works really well, right? So we see it here. This is the first stage. So if it was not very costly to move from one cell to another for a horse, you would have horses very early. So for example, the Comanche lived in an area where it was easy for horses to go. And because of this, the Comanche had horses for 170 years. But that's not true for the Takelma, right? These guys had fewer years probably because it was very hard for horses to move there. Anyway.
Another question.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not saying what seems to be one other important data point for your study, and that is the horse population itself. It seems to me that you've got a horse population with the colonizers, and then you have a wild horse population, and then you're going to have a horse population among the different tribes as they adopt them. But I'm not seeing reflected any database on where those on that populations, where they were concentrated, numbers.
Okay.
It affects the conflict. If I don't have to fight you to get horses, if I could find the wild herd, get horses there, that's another source. It's also a way to mitigate conflict.
I agree. What I can tell you is that what I understand is that initially there were very few horses from the colonizers, right? This guy, De Soto, left, 500 horses, or a very small number, that's what the books say. And these horses spread around. I don't know if they did it on their own or they were stolen by nations or traded. That we don't know, and it's very hard to tell. What this instrument seems to say is that it's possible that many of them moved on their own because they seem to move, or they seem to be more abundant in areas where it's easy for horses to go. I don't know if the Winnebago got the horses because they just found them there, wild horses, or because they traded them with the cattle, or they stole it from them. It's going to be hard to pin down that. So we're kind of saying there may be many reasons why horses moved around, but it seems that geography played a role. That's what we're saying. Even if you steal horses, it's still maybe easier for you to steal horses and move them through areas where there are no rivers and lakes and stuff like this, right? Where you have lots of grass and things like that. We also tried to look at grass, by the way, to see if we could use it as instrument, right? Like places with grass being more appealing for horses. That's tricky to do for reasons I can discuss, but yeah, no, point well taken. I agree. I don't have much time, so let me move on. Oh, I'm almost done. Yeah, so that's good. Right, so what do we conclude? I'll tell you about some things we're trying to do too. So we basically find a significant relationship between horse adoption and conflict. That's what we're finding at this point. Treaties are also less likely to be signed if nations had more reliance on horses. So it looks like horses are bad in that sense. They create more conflict, they create less treaties. That's one reading of what we're saying. Having the same language is good in the sense of less conflict and more treaties. Nations that rely on bison have more conflicts, not surprisingly. And if you move around a lot, you sign more treaties. I don't know if you have more conflicts. For some reason, we don't have that in that regression. What do we plan to do? Too many things. One is to explore climate shocks. That'll be a nice instrument that may, not even an instrument, could be an X variable, right? A regressor. Is it the case that when there are droughts or when you have a bad climate shock, there is more conflict? This has been done by Ted Miguel and co-authors, right, in Africa. So it'll be, if we had good data on climate shocks, which I'm not sure we do, it would be nice to explore that. We'd like to have a theory of conflicts because I'm not a conflict person. I'm quite new with all that, but the Schelling model seems to be a good way to start, and I'm sure you can suggest many other theoretical models. For indigeneity, we have this instrumental variable that we think works pretty well, and the issue here is that it's a cross-sectional instrument, right? It looks at geography at a point in time, and our data is paneled, so we're not sure how to use that for our regressions. We need to think a bit more about that. We'd like to incorporate GAN frontiers, Western frontiers in the regressions, and yeah, that's pretty much it.
Great. We have some questions.
Yeah.
First of all, the last frontier in North America wasn't the West, it was the plains. The Spaniards colonized from the west and south, Arizona, New Mexico, until the Mexican-American War in 1848. But the United States started pushing heavily west after the Civil War. The way that the United States was going to grow was to seize land and resources in the Middle West. Most of those treaties were with Indian tribes, and they had to do with the United States trying to acquire land and resources in exchange for promises the United States, unfortunately, mostly did not keep. What happened was that as tribes were driven off land, where they were either growing food or maybe they were fishing, were driven off land either by other tribes or by the colonizers, then they went to hunting. That's why they had to rely more on bison. That meant they had to get horses because you don't hunt bison on foot.
Mm-hmm.
And the other big influencer you might want to look at is the Catholic Church. The English and French wanted to drive Native Americans off their land, seize their resources, and kill them if they had to get them out of the way. Spanish were heavily Catholic. They were more interested in trying to convert them first.
Okay, yeah, very good point. I'll think about all that. Do we have data on, well, maybe we can talk later on about religion and how it was spread among different areas? I guess there must be data on that, but
You can probably get
Native American tribes kept very poor statistics.
But the Catholics, I think the Catholics keep pretty good paperwork.
A lot of records.
The Catholics, yeah.
And we have at least one more question.
And to some extent, later on,
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
the Americas were not
Thanks.
known for keeping records.